Welcome back. Before we go on to consider some of the nuances in the question of whether disasters are good for the economy, let's review the conclusions we reached in the last lecture. And in the process, we'll reinforce the importance of the distinction between rate and level that we introduced in the last lecture. The white trend line on this graph represents an economy's growth path in terms of output or real GDP. The solid portion of the line is created from data on the actual performance of the economy, and the dot dash portion projects output in the future were the economy to continue on this growth path. The natural disaster disrupts this pattern by increasing resource scarcity and output falls, as represented by the red line. How far and how quickly output falls depends on the characteristics of the particular disaster, but as we established in the first lecture, output must fall. The lowest point on the red curve represents the full impact of the disaster, and the space between the red and white lines is the production that didn't take place. At some point, however, the recovery begins. On our graph, the red output line begins to rise back toward the pre-disaster trend line. And note that the recovery portion of the red curve is steeper than the corresponding white trend line, meaning that in this best case scenario, the recovery is rapid, and in fact, the rate of economic growth is higher than it was projected to be had there been no disaster. In the first lecture, we commented on the difference between rates and levels in discussing economic growth, and that distinction is clearly on display in this graph. We looked at situations like an increased capital to labor ratio, for example, that might lead to a greater rate of economic growth and thus seem to be good for the economy. You also saw in the mystery clues that this higher growth rate post-disaster can be found in the United States, for example, after the Spanish flu, giving the misleading impression that disasters are good. But take a closer look at the model, and remember that this is a best-case scenario. Even when the recovery is complete and the economy has returned to its pre-disaster growth trend, it does so at a lower level. QP, in purple, is the higher potential level of output that the economy would have achieved had the disaster not disrupted the growth pattern. The lost potential production, which clearly displayed on this model, is largely invisible in people's everyday lives. The effect of rapid redline recovery growth rate, on the other hand, is very visible and tangible, reinforcing the impression that good comes from disasters. The importance of the disconnect between more and less visible effects of economic change was most memorably described in economic literature in the mid-19th century by Frederick Bastiat. He said, "There is only one difference between a bad economist and a good one. The bad economist confines himself to the visible effect. The good economist takes into account both the effect that can be seen and those effects that must be foreseen." In an essay entitled "What is Seen and What is Not Seen," Bastiat identified what has come to be known as the broken window fallacy. The event that Bastiat was referring to was probably only considered a disaster by the young son of James Goodfellow, but the analogy to the impact of larger-scale disasters on the economy is perfectly apt. In relating the incident of the broken window, Bastiat is less concerned with the incorrigible son and the furious father than with the reaction of the amused bystanders, who try to calm the senior Goodfellow with platitudes. "It's an ill wind that blows nobody some good. Such accidents keep industry going. Why, what would become of the glaziers if no one ever broke a window?" Now, as you listen to Bastiat's analysis of the economic impacts of the broken window, think hurricane or tsunami or earthquake. Suppose that it will cost 6 francs to repair the damage. The glazier will come, do his job, receive 6 francs, congratulate himself, and bless in his heart the careless child. That is what is seen. But if by way of deduction you conclude that it is good to break windows, that it helps to circulate money, that it results in encouraging industry in general, I'm obliged to cry out, that will never do. Your theory stops at what is seen. It does not take into account what is not seen. With the purple line on our graph, what is not seen turns out to be significant. It is not seen that since our citizen spent 6 francs for one thing, he will not be able to spend them for another. It is not seen that if he had not had a window pane to replace, he would have replaced, for example, his worn-out shoes, or added another book to his library. In brief, he would have put his 6 francs to some other use for which he will not now have them. Let us next consider industry in general. The window having been broken, the glass industry gets 6 francs worth of encouragement. That's what is seen. If the window had not been broken, the shoe industry, or some other, would have received 6 francs worth of encouragement. That is what is not seen. Bastiat's logic holds if we move from one window to many, and from considering the impact on industries to the impact on entire economies. Bastiat would have recognized, but not sympathized with, our confusing of rates and levels of growth, and our preoccupation with the tangible evidence of recovery, or our failure to recognize lost potential. I can't imagine, however, that he would have been pleased to find us still debating a point he laid to rest over 150 years ago. Faced with our question of whether disasters are good for the economy, his brusque response would surely have been, "Destruction is not profitable." Unfortunately, the myth of disasters being good for the economy is terribly resilient, and we do have some modern economists who either haven't read their Bastiat carefully enough or have forgotten it, or I'm not sure which. In any case, they should know better. Here's one. Respected Princeton University economist and writer Paul Krugman, in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attack on New York City, said, "Ghastly as it may seem to say this, the terror attack could do some economic good. The destruction will stimulate the economy through business investment and rebuilding." And by the way, he just won a Nobel Prize. Now, to which I can only imagine Bastiat saying something like, "Excuse me, Professor? Would you like to think about that a little more carefully?" Well, we don't have Bastiat to respond with his inimitable sarcasm, but we're fortunate to have others who've seen the power of his thinking about the seen and the unseen. Walter Williams, George Mason University economist and noted writer, offers Krugman a pointed, if slightly less caustic rebuttal than I'd imagine he'd have received from Bastiat. We know this to be fishy just by asking, would there have been even greater economic good if the terrorists succeeded in destroying buildings in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and all other major cities? Of course, you and I know that this is utter nonsense. Property destruction always lowers the wealth of a nation. I hope one of Krugman's students asks him, if property destruction is so good for the economy, why aren't Beirut and Belfast boomtowns? Okay, with that, let's move on. There are 2 more issues we want to address before leaving the question of whether disasters are good for the economy, and both issues deal with the hard-to-quantify human factor. First, we have to acknowledge that post-disaster measures of economic growth and well-being focus, because practicality mandates that they do, on the tangible aspects of the standard of living of the survivors. The personal losses and suffering that exact a huge toll on individuals are rendered nearly invisible in the more broadly focused analysis of the economy. But these costs are nonetheless real for being unseen. And although they aren't effectively captured in statistical measures like GDP and GDP per capita, economists do recognize their existence. A 2006 Harvard School of Public Health study noted, if we take the economic value of human life into account, however, it's clear that epidemics have a high cost. How high depends on the economic value one assigns to life. People who die during epidemics, along with their families, obviously lose out economically. One could, moreover, add other losses to this if one places an economic value on intangible impacts, such as the lost companionship and love felt by friends and relatives of the dead. The second issue is largely also unseen, or at least uncaptured, and that's the cost of what might have been and wasn't, the unrealized potential of disaster victims and the contributions they might have made. Interestingly, study of this issue interfaces with controversy over whether or not there's such a thing as overpopulation, in the sense that at some point having more people is bad and having fewer is better. The link between this controversy and disaster impact studies lies in the proposition that disaster-related population losses in less developed countries might serve a useful function in relieving so-called overpopulation pressure on resources, and thereby rising standards of living. The late economist Julian Simon vigorously challenged this notion, pointing to the unseen dimensions of population loss, the knowledge and advances that do not happen. A highly regarded professor of economics and a policy analyst, Simon became a public figure when he took on popular writer Paul Ehrlich during the heyday of the environmental movement in the 1970s. Dismissing Ehrlich's predictions of a coming population bomb, Simon argued the economic benefits of population growth. Calling human ingenuity the ultimate resource, he pointed to the historical record to argue that, all else being equal, advances in technology and standard of living are proportional to population size. Simon was intrigued by the work of earlier economists trying to decipher the sources of economic growth and the relative contributions of physical and human capital improvements. Building on their conclusions that improvements in technological practice are the major source of economic growth, and thus of improved standards of living, Simon undertook to plot the history of the world's great discoveries against population. He concluded that, all else being equal, quote, the number of improvements depends on the number of people using their heads. It bears quoting Simon here at length as he forcefully states the case for population as the source of our only truly inexhaustible resource. The source of improvements in productivity is the human mind, and a human mind is seldom found apart from a human body. And because improvements, their invention and their adoption, come from people, the amount of improvement plainly depends on the number of people available to use their minds. Overpopulation? Simon would say, no, not so much. The data show clearly that the bigger the population of a country, the greater the number of scientists and the larger the amount of scientific knowledge produced. More specifically, scientific output is proportional to population size in countries at the same level of income. That bears emphasizing, in countries at the same level of income. And note here that Simon's not just arguing that the more people there are, the more geniuses we'll have. He clearly recognizes the power of the margin, the everyday improvements made by everyday people. The main contribution that additional persons make to society is the new knowledge of all kinds, scientific, organizational, and everyday knowledge, that they create and leave behind them. And to repeat an earlier statement, these gains are the result not only of geniuses, but of a real number of workaday ingenious people. Finally, we have to clarify for our students that when we assert that disasters are not good for the economy, we're not denying the possibility that there are individuals and groups who may reap benefits. We have to teach our students to avoid what's called in logic the fallacy of composition. We commit this logical fallacy when we assume that an accurate generalization about a group must necessarily be true of every member of the group. For example, the law of demand teaches us that as price rises, ceteris paribus, the amount of gasoline purchased will fall. We commit the fallacy of composition if we then conclude that at higher prices, everyone purchases less gas. To assert that disasters are not good for the economy, therefore, is not to deny the possibility that individual people may actually benefit. Clearly, some do, but we shouldn't be surprised. The National Voluntary Content Standards in Economics remind us that economic change, whether for the better or for the worse, produces both winners and losers. Yes, individuals and groups of people may and do benefit from disasters, but that does not undermine the fundamental fact that disasters are not good for the economy overall. We have many, many examples throughout history of individuals or groups benefiting from disaster-caused economic change. After the Black Plague, agricultural workers got higher wages because so many serfs and peasants had died. After the Chicago fire, the price of fire brick went sky high, and the Philadelphia producer made a fortune. The Marriott hotel chain benefited from the influx of insurance and relief workers to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And because so many barges sank in the hurricane, those left on the Mississippi brought in as much as 4 times the normal daily shipping rate. So, Bastiat's seen and unseen dichotomy can help us put the winners and losers idea into perspective. After the immediate impact of the disaster, what we see is the flurry of recovery activity that uses resources and creates jobs, all of which seems good. As time passes, our acute awareness of the costs, the picture of death and destruction, begins to recede. Eventually, the costs fade in the big picture, becoming the unseen to the economy, no matter how real they may continue to be to individual victims and their families. By looking at the different impacts on individuals, have we undermined the conclusion we reached in the first lesson, that disasters are not good for the economy? I don't think so. Instead, I think that we've learned to distinguish between the economy as a whole and the individual actors in that economy. So yes, some individuals do and some do not benefit from disaster-related economic change. But disasters do increase scarcity and reduce output, pushing the economy backwards down the path of well-being, even if momentarily. And economic activity during the recovery process may appear to speed up. But remember that it starts from a reduced level, and even in the best-case scenario, it never catches up. If there's any good news revealed by our study of disasters and that of economic historians, it's that economies tend to be remarkably resilient. We don't have any evidence to suggest that the spurt of economic activity following a disaster can boost an economy's performance above pre-disaster levels. But history does leave us somewhat amazed at the speed with which free, well-managed economies rebound. Nonetheless, post-disaster improvements and even higher standards of living among survivors should not blind us to the reality of loss. To posit that disaster should be welcomed as an economic stimulus would lead us to the logical but ridiculous policy of trying to boost an economy of a declining city by deliberately burning it down around its residents. We can't let ourselves be distracted from the bottom line. Disasters increase scarcity and thereby reduce our ability to provide for people's wants and needs. This ends the lecture material for Lesson 1. Please return to the lesson and assignment screen, and don't forget to check in on the discussion board and on the posted long-term project requirement. After you complete Lesson 1, we'll come back here to consider the role that institutions can play in helping us to deal with the aftermath of disasters. Having established that disasters are indeed setbacks on the path to economic well-being, we can proceed to Lessons 2, 3, and 4, and the question of how our economic, governmental, and social institutions can best respond to those setbacks.